Change by Arthur Machen. Here, said old Mr. Vincent Rimmer, fumbling in the pigeonholes of his great and ancient bureau, is an oddity which may interest you. He drew a sheet of paper out of the dark place where it had been hidden and handed it to Reynolds, his curious guest. The oddity was an ordinary sheet of notepaper of a sort which has long been popular, a bluish-gray with slight flecks and streaks of a darker blue embedded in its substance. It had yellowed a little with age at the edges. The outer page was blank. Reynolds laid it open and spread it out on the table beside his chair. He read something like this: A, E, E, I, E, A, I, O, E, O, E, I, A, O, O, A, O, A, E, I, E, O, I, E, A, E, I. Reynolds scanned it with stupefied perplexity. "What on earth is it?" he said. "Does it mean anything? Is it a cipher, or a silly game, or what?" Mr. Rimmer chuckled. "I thought it might puzzle you," he remarked. "Do you happen to notice anything about the writing? Anything out of the way at all?" Reynolds scanned the document more closely. "Well, I don't know that there is anything out of the way in the script itself. The letters are rather big, perhaps, and they are rather clumsily formed, but it's difficult to judge handwriting by a few letters repeated again and again. But apart from the writing, what is it?" "That's a question that must wait a bit. There are many strange things related to that bit of paper, but one of the strangest things about it is this, that it is intimately connected with the Darren mystery." "What mystery did you say? The Darren mystery? I don't think I've ever heard of it." "Well, it was a little before your time, and in any case, I don't see how you could have heard of it. There were certainly some very curious and unusual circumstances in the case, but I don't think that they were generally known, and if they were known, they were not understood. You won't wonder at that, perhaps, when you consider that the bit of paper before you was one of those circumstances." "But what exactly happened?" "That is largely a matter of conjecture. But anyway, here's the outside of the case for a beginning. Now, to start with, I don't suppose you've ever been to Meirion. Well, you should go. It's a beautiful county in West Wales, with a fine sea-coast and some very pleasant places to stay at, and none of them too large or too popular. One of the smallest of these places, Trenant, is just a village. There is a wooded height above it called the Alt, and down below, the church with a Celtic cross in the churchyard, a dozen or so of cottages, a row of lodging houses on the slope round the corner, a few more cottages dotted along the road to Meros, and that's all. Below the village are marshy meadows where the brook that comes out from the hills spreads abroad, and then the dunes and the sea, stretching away to the Dragon's Head in the far east, and enclosed to the west by the beginnings of the limestone cliffs. There are fine broad sands all the way between Trenant and Porth, the market town about 1.5 miles away, and it's just the place for children. Well, just 45 years ago, Trenant was having a very successful season. In August, there must have been 18 or 19 visitors in the village. I was staying in Porth at the time, and when I walked over, it struck me that the Trenant beach was quite crowded, 8 or 9 children castle building and learning to swim, and looking for shells and all the usual diversions. The grown-up people sat in groups on the edge of the dunes and read and gossiped, or took a turn towards Porth, or perhaps tried to catch prawns in the rock pools at the other end of the sands. Altogether, a very pleasant, happy scene in its simple way, and As it was a beautiful summer, I have no doubt they all enjoyed themselves very much. I walked to Trenant and back 3 or 4 times, and I noticed that most of the children were more or less in charge of a very pretty dark girl, quite young, who seemed to advise in laying out the ground plan of the castle, and to take off her stockings and tuck up her skirts. We thought a lot of legs in those days, when the bathers required supervision. She also indicated the kind of shells which deserved the attention of collectors, an extremely serviceable girl. It seemed that this girl, Alice Hayes, was really in charge of the children, or of the greater part of them. She was a sort of nursery governess, or lady of all work to Mrs. Brown, who had come down from London in the early part of July with Miss Hayes and little Michael, a child of 8, who refused to recover nicely from his attack of measles. Mr. Brown had joined them at the end of the month with the 2 elder children, Jack and Rosamond. Then there were the Smiths, with their little family, and the Robinsons with their 3, and the fathers and mothers, sitting on the beach every morning, got to know each other very easily. Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Robinson soon appreciated Miss Hayes's merits as a child herd. They noticed that Mrs. Brown sat placid and went on knitting in the sun, quite safe and unperturbed, while they suffered from recurrent alarms. Jack Smith, though barely 14, would be seen dashing through the waves out to sea, as if he had made up his mind to swim to the Dragon's Head, about 20 miles away. Or Jane Robinson, in bright pink, would appear suddenly right away among the rocks of the point, ready to vanish into the perilous unknown round the corner. Hence alarms and excursions, tiring expeditions of rescue and remonstrance, through soft sand or over slippery rocks under a hot sun. And then these ladies would discover that certain of their offspring had entirely disappeared or were altogether missing from the landscape, and dreadful and true tales of children who had driven tunnels into the sand and had been overwhelmed therein rushed to the mind. And all the while Mrs. Brown sat serene, confident in the overseership of her Miss Hayes. So, as was to be gathered, the other 2 took counsel together. Mrs. Brown was approached, and something called an arrangement was made, by which Miss Hayes undertook the joint mastership of all 3 packs, greatly to the ease of Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Robinson. It was about this time, I suppose, that I got to know this group of holiday-makers. I had met Smith, who I knew slightly in town, in the streets of Porth, just as I was setting out for one of my morning walks. We strolled together to Trenant on the firm sand down by the water's edge, and introductions went round, and so I joined the party, and sat with them, watching the various diversions of the children and the capable superintendence of Miss Hayes. "Now there's a queer thing about this little place," said Brown, a genial man, connected, I believe, with Lloyd's. "Wouldn't you say this was as healthy a spot as any you could find? Well sheltered from the north, southern aspect, never too cold in winter, fresh sea breeze in the summer. What could you have more?" "Well," I replied, "it always agrees with me very well. A little relaxing, perhaps, but I like being relaxed. Isn't it a healthy place, then? What makes you think so?" "I'll tell you. We have rooms in Govan Terrace, up there on the hillside. The other night I woke up with a coughing fit. I got out of bed to get a drink of water, and then had a look out the window to see what sort of night it was. I didn't like the look of those clouds in the southwest after sunset the night before. As you can see, the upper windows of Govan Terrace command a good many of the village houses. And, do you know, there was a light in almost every house. At 2 o'clock in the morning! Apparently, the village is full of sick people. But who would have thought it?" We were sitting a little apart from the rest. Smith had brought a London paper from Porth, and he and Robinson had their heads together over the city article. The 3 women were knitting and talking hard, and down by the blue creaming water, Miss Hayes and her crew were playing happily in the sunshine. "Do you mind," I said to Brown, "if I swear you to secrecy? A limited secrecy. I don't want you to speak of this to any of the village people. They wouldn't like it. And have you told your wife or any of the party about what you saw?" "As a matter of fact, I haven't said a word to anybody. Illness isn't a very cheerful topic for a holiday, is it? But what's up? You don't mean to say there's some sort of epidemic in the place that they're keeping dark? I say, that would be awful. We should have to leave at once. Think of the children. Nothing of the kind. I don't think that there's a single case of illness in the place, unless you count old Thomas Evans, who has been in what he calls a decline for 30 years. You won't say anything. Then I'm going to give you a shock. The people have a light burning in their houses all night to keep out the fairies. It was a success. Brown looked frightened. Not of the fairies, most certainly not. Rather at the reversion of his established order of things. He occupied his business in the city. He lived in an extremely comfortable house at Addiscombe. He was a keen, though sane adherent of the Liberal Party. And in that world between these points, there was no room at all, either for fairies or for people who believed in fairies. The latter were almost as fabulous to him as the former, and still more objectionable. "Look here," he said at last, "you're pulling my leg. Nobody believes in fairies. They haven't for hundreds of years. Shakespeare didn't believe in fairies. He says so." I let him run on. He implored me to tell him whether it was typhoid, or only measles, or even chicken pox. I said at last, "You seem very positive on the subject of fairies. Are you sure there are no such things?" "Of course I am," said Brown very crossly. "How do you know?" It is a shocking thing to be asked a question like that, to which, be it observed, there is no answer. I left him seething dangerously. "Remember," I said, "not a word of lit windows to anybody, but if you are uneasy as to epidemics, ask the doctor about it." He nodded his head glumly. I knew he was drawing all sorts of false conclusions, and for the rest of our stay I would say that he did not seek me out until the last day of his visit. I had no doubt that he put me down as a believer in fairies and a maniac. But it is, I consider, good for men who live between the city and Liberal politics and Addiscombe to be made to realize that there is a world elsewhere. And, as it happens, it was quite true that most of the Trenant people believed in the fairies and were horribly afraid of them. But this was only an interlude. I often strolled over and joined the party, and I took up my freedom with the young members by contributing posts and a tennis net to the beach sports. They had brought down rackets and balls in the vague idea that they might be able to get a game somehow and somewhere, and my contribution was warmly welcomed. I helped Miss Hayes to fix the net, and she marked out the court with the help of many suggestions from the elder children, to which she did not pay the slightest attention. I think the constant disputes as to whether the ball was in or out brightened the game, though Wimbledon would not have approved. And sometimes the elder children accompanied their parents to Porth in the evening and watched the famous Japanese jugglers or Pepper's Ghost at the assembly rooms, or listened to the mysterious musicians at the De Barry Gardens, and altogether everybody had, you would say, a very jolly time. It all came to a dreadful end. One morning, when I had come out on my usual morning stroll from Porth, and had got to the camping ground of the party at the edge of the dunes, I found somewhat to my surprise that there was nobody there. I was afraid that Brown had been in part justified in his dread of concealed epidemics, and thus some of the children had caught something in the village. So I walked up in the direction of Govan Terrace, and found Brown standing at the bottom of his flight of steps, and looking very much upset. I hailed him. "I say," I began, "I hope you weren't right after all. None of the children came down with measles or anything of that sort." "It's something worse than measles. We none of us know what has happened. The doctor can make nothing of it. Come in, and we can talk it over." Just then, a procession came down the steps leading from a house a few doors further on. First of all, there was the porter from the station, with a pile of luggage on his truck. Then came the two elder Smith children, Jack and Millicent. And finally, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Mr. Smith was carrying something wrapped in a bundle in his arms. "Where's Bob?" He was the youngest, a brave, rosy little man of 5 or 6. "Smith's carrying him," murmured Brown. "What's happened? Has he hurt himself on the rocks? I hope it's nothing serious." I was going forward to make my enquiries, but Brown put a hand on my arm and checked me. Then I looked at the Smith party more closely, and I saw at once that there was something very much amiss. The 2 elder children had been crying, though the boy was doing his best to put up a brave face against disaster, whatever it was. Mrs. Smith had drawn her veil over her face and stumbled as she walked, and on Smith's face there was a horror as of ill dreams. "Look," said Brown in his low voice. Smith had half turned as he set out with his burden to walk down the hill to the station. I don't think he knew we were there. I don't think any of the party had noticed us as we stood at the bottom step, half hidden by a blossoming shrub. But as he turned uncertainly, like a man in the dark, the wrappings fell away a little from what he carried, and I saw a little wizened yellow face peering out, malignant, deplorable. I turned helplessly to Brown as that most wretched procession went on its way and vanished out of sight. "What on earth has happened? That's not Bobby. Who is it?" "Come into the house," said Brown, and he went before me up the long flight of steps that led to the terrace. There was a shriek and a noise of thin, shrill, high-pitched laughter as we came into the lodging-house. "That's Miss Hayes, in blaspheming hysterics," said Brown grimly. "My wife's looking after her. The children are in the room at the back. I daren't let them go out by themselves in this awful place." He beat with his foot on the floor and glared at me, awestruck, a solid man, shaken. "Well," he said at last, "I'll tell you what we know, and as far as I can make out, that's very little. However, you know Miss Hayes, who helps Mrs. Brown with the children, had more or less taken over the charge of the lot, the young Robinsons and the Smiths, too. You've seen how well she looks after them all on the sands in the morning. In the afternoon she's been taking them inland for a change. You know there's beautiful country if you go a little way inland, rather wild and woody, but still very nice, pleasant and shady. Miss Hayes thought that the all-day glare of the sun on the sands might not be very good for the small ones, and my wife agreed with her. So they took their teas with them and picnicked in the woods and enjoyed themselves very much, I believe. They didn't go more than a couple of miles, or 3 at the outside, and the little ones used to take turns on a go-kart. They never seemed too tired. Yesterday, at lunch, they were talking about some caves at a place called Darren, about 2 miles away. My children seemed very anxious to see them, and Mrs. Probert, our landlady, said they were quite safe, so the Smiths and Robinsons were called in, and they were enthusiastic too, and the whole party set off with their tea baskets and candles and matches in Miss Hayes's charge. Somehow they made a later start than usual, and from what I can make out, they enjoyed themselves so much in the cool dark cave, first of all exploring, and then looking for treasure, and winding up with tea by candlelight, that they didn't notice how the time was going. Nobody had a watch, and by the time they'd packed up their traps and came out from underground, it was quite dark. They had a little trouble making out the way at first, but not very much, and came along in high spirits, tumbling over molehills and each other, and finding it all quite an adventure. They had got down in the road there, and were sorting themselves out into 3 parties, when somebody called out, "Where's Bobby Smith?" Well, he wasn't there. The usual story, everybody thought he was with somebody else. They were all mixed up in the dark, talking and laughing and shrieking at the top of their voices, and taking everything for granted. I suppose it was like that. But poor little Bob was missing. You can guess what a scene there was. Everybody was much too frightened to scold Miss Hayes, who had no doubt been extremely careless, to say the least of it. Not like her. Robinson pulled us together. He told Mrs. Smith that the little chap would be perfectly all right. There were no precipices to fall over, and no water to fall into, the way they'd been. That it was a warm night, and the child had had a good stuffing tea, and he would be as right as rain when they found him. So we got a man from the farm, with a lantern, and Miss Hayes to show us exactly where they'd been, and Smith and Robinson and I went off to find poor Bobby, feeling a good deal better than at first. I noticed that the farm man seemed a good deal put out when we told him what had happened and where we were going. "Got lost in the Darren?" he asked. "Indeed, that is a pity." That set off Smith at once, and he asked Williams what he meant. What was the matter with the place? Williams said there was nothing the matter with it at all whatever, but it was a tiresome place to be in after dark. That reminded me of what you were saying a couple weeks ago at the people here. Some damn superstitious nonsense, I said to myself, and thanked God it was nothing worse. I thought the fellow might be going to tell us of a masked bog or something like that. I gave Smith a hint in a whisper as to where the land lay, and we went on, hoping to come on little Bob any minute. Nearly all the way we were going through open fields without any cover or bracken or anything of that sort, and Williams kept twirling his lantern, and Miss Hayes and the rest of us called out the child's name. There didn't seem much chance of missing him. However, we saw nothing of him till we got to the Darren. It's an odd sort of place, I should think. You're in an ordinary field with a gentle upward slope, and you come to a gate, and down you go into a deep, narrow valley. A regular nest of valleys, as far as I could make out in the dark, one leading into another, and the sides covered with trees. The famous caves were on one of these steep slopes, and of course we all went in. They didn't stretch far. Nobody could have got lost in them, even if the candles gave out. We searched the place thoroughly, and saw where the children had had their tea. No signs of Bobby. So we went on down the valley between the woods, till we came to where it opens out into a wide space, with one tree growing all alone in the middle. And then we heard a miserable whining noise, like some little creature that's got hurt. And there under the tree was what you saw poor Smith carrying in his arms this morning. It fought like a wild cat when Smith tried to pick it up, and jabbered some unearthly sort of gibberish. Then Miss Hayes came along and seemed to soothe it, and it's been quiet ever since. The man with the lantern was shaking with terror. The sweat was pouring down his face. I stared hard at Brown, and I thought to myself, you are very much in the same condition as Williams. Brown was obviously overcome with dread. We sat there in silence. "Why did you say it?" I asked. "Why don't you say him?" "You saw." "Do you mean to tell me seriously that you don't believe that child you helped to bring home was Bobby? What does Mrs. Smith say?" "She says the child's clothes are the same. I suppose it must be Bobby. The doctor from Porth says the child must have had a severe shock. I don't think he knows anything about it." He stuttered over his words, and said at last, "I was thinking of what you said about the lighted windows. I hoped you might be able to help. Can you do anything? We are leaving this afternoon, all of us. Is there nothing to be done?" "I'm afraid not." I had nothing else to say. We shook hands and parted without more words. The next day I walked over to the Darren. There was something fearful about the place, even in the haze of a golden afternoon. As Brown had said, the entrance and the disclosure of it were sudden and abrupt. The fields of the approach held no hint of what was to come. Then, past the gate, the ground fell violently away on every side. Grey rocks of an ill shape pierced through it, and the ash trees on the steep slopes overshadowed all. The descent was into silence, without the singing of a bird, into a wizard shade. At the far end, where the wooded heights retreated somewhat, there was the open space, or circus, or turf, and in the middle of it a very ancient twisted thorn tree, beneath which the party in the dark had found the little creature that whined and cried out in unknown speech. I turned about, and on my way back I entered the caves, and lit the carriage candle I had brought with me. There was nothing much to see. I never think there is much to see in caves. There was the place where the children and others before them had taken their tea, with a ring of blackened stones within which many fires of twigs had been kindled. In caves or out of caves, Townsfolk in the country are always alike in leaving untidy and unseemly litter behind, and here were the usual scraps of greasy paper, daubed with smears of jam and butter, the half-eaten sandwich, and the gnawed crust. Amidst all this nastiness, I saw a piece of folded paper, and in sheer idleness picked it up and opened it. You have just seen it. When I asked you if you saw anything peculiar about the writing, you said that the letters were rather big and clumsy. The reason of that is that they were written by a child. I don't think you examined the back of the second leaf. Look, Rosamund Brown, that is, and beneath, there in the corner. Reynolds looked and read, and gaped aghast. That was her other name, her name in the dark. Name in the dark? In the dark night of the Sabbath. That pretty girl had caught them all. They were in her hands, those wretched children, like the clay images she made. I found one of those things hidden in a cleft of the rocks, near the place where they had made their fire. I ground it into dust beneath my feet. And I wonder what her name was. They called her, I think, the bridegroom and the bride. Did you ever find out who she was, or where she came from? Very little, only that she had been a mistress at the Home for Christian Orphans in North Tottenham, where there was a hideous scandal some years before. Then she must have been older than she looked, according to your description. Possibly. They sat in silence for a few minutes. Then Reynolds said, "But I haven't asked you about this formula, or whatever you may call it. All these vowels here. Is it a cipher?" "No, but it is really a great curiosity, and it raises some extraordinary questions which are outside this particular case. To begin with, and I am sure I could go much farther back than my beginning, if I had the necessary scholarship. I once read an English rendering of a Greek manuscript of the 2nd or 3rd century. I won't be certain which. It's a long time since I've seen the thing. The translator and editor of it was of the opinion that it was a Mithraic ritual. But I have gathered that weightier authorities are strongly inclined to discredit this view. At any rate, it was no doubt an initiation rite into some mystery. Possibly it had Gnostic connections. I don't know. But our interest lies in this, that one of the stages or portals, or whatever you call them, consisted, almost exactly, of that formula you have in your hand. I don't say that the vowels and double vowels are in the same order. I don't think the Greek manuscript had as many AEs or AAs. But it is perfectly clear that the two documents are of the same kind, and have the same purpose. And advancing a little in time from the Greek manuscript, I don't think it is very surprising that the final operation of an incantation in medieval and later magic consisted of this wailing on vowels arranged in a certain order. But here is something that is surprising. A good many years ago, I strolled one Sunday morning into a church in Bloomsbury, the headquarters of a highly respectable sect, and in the middle of a very dignified ritual, there rose quite suddenly, without preface or warning, this very sound, a wild wail on vowels. The effect was astounding, anyhow. Whether it was terrifying or merely funny is a matter of taste. You'll have guessed what I heard. They call it speaking with tongues, and they believe it to be a heavenly language, and I need scarcely say that they mean very well. But the problem is, how did a congregation of such solid Scotch Presbyterians hit on that queer, ancient, and not over-sanctified method of expressing spiritual emotion? It is a singular puzzle. And that woman, that is not by any means so difficult. The good Scotchmen, I can't think how they did it, got hold of something that didn't belong to them. She was in her own tradition, and, as they say down there, Asakai Dasa, the darkness is undying.